He was once hailed as the embodiment of royal perfection. Tall, broad-shouldered, with shimmering reddish-gold hair and an aura that drew awe from even his enemies. Young Henry Tudor was seen not just as a prince, but as a divine promise in human form. When he ascended the throne of England in 1509, only 17 years old, the court whispered that no kingdom had ever been ruled by a monarch so handsome, so athletic, and so blessed by the heavens. Foreign ambassadors wrote with admiration. A Venetian envoy even claimed that Henry's beauty and presence eclipsed that of every Christian prince alive. He was the very image of Renaissance power, graceful, intelligent, adored. But few could have foreseen the ghastly transformation that would take place, not only in his body, but in his soul. Fewer still could have imagined that this radiant prince would one day rot from the inside out while still alive, consumed by disease, paranoia, and the unbearable weight of his own legacy. The unraveling began with a single, violent moment. In January 1536, King Henry took part in a jousting tournament at Greenwich. He was 44 years old, no longer the boy prince, but still physically formidable and proud of his prowess. Then came the fall. His horse crashed down upon him, its full weight crushing Henry's right leg. For 2 long hours, the king lay unconscious. The entire court held its breath. Though he eventually awoke, something inside Henry had changed forever. The leg injury never fully healed. Over time, the wound turned into an open ulcer, one that festered, suppurated, and reeked with such intensity that courtiers would smell the king before they saw him. The stench was unbearable, but no one dared flinch. To react with disgust in the king's presence was not merely impolite, it was dangerous. The pain from the wound was constant. It pulsed with every heartbeat. And with that physical torment came another, more subtle transformation. A black fog of rage and suspicion began to cloud Henry's once brilliant mind. It was no coincidence, perhaps, that in that same year, shortly after his accident, Henry ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Whether any of it was true no longer mattered. The king's mercy, like his youth, was gone. In the years that followed, the injury dictated everything. Henry's ability to move was limited. His body began to swell. The former athlete soon tipped the scales at over 400 pounds. His once muscular waistline ballooned from a trim 89 centimeters in his youth to more than 130. He could no longer climb stairs, no longer walk unaided. He was hoisted between rooms in a specially designed system of pulleys. Palace doorways had to be widened to fit the ever-growing monarch. But this was not just the story of a man who became obese. This was the slow-motion collapse of a king and of a myth. Beneath the silks and gold, a body was decaying. Beneath the crown, a mind was fraying.
As Henry's body grew heavier and weaker, the changes in his mind became more frightening than the swelling of his flesh. Physicians at the time attempted everything they knew, and most of it, we now know, only made things worse. The ulcer on his leg, instead of healing, expanded into a gaping wound. They cauterized it with red-hot irons. They applied ointments laced with mercury and arsenic. They drained his blood, convinced it would release the poisons from within. Nothing worked. In fact, these treatments likely accelerated the decay. Over time, his skin peeled back, revealing bone beneath layers of rotting tissue. The smell was so revolting that courtiers claimed it could be detected 3 rooms away, and still, no one dared to mention it. But the wound was not the only thing poisoning Henry. His diet, lavish, endless, and entirely unchecked, fed his growing illness. Daily, he consumed meals fit for a dozen men, plates of roasted game, dense meat pies, gallons of wine and ale. Vegetables were almost entirely absent. According to royal kitchen records, the king regularly consumed over 5,000 calories a day, without any form of exercise. He could barely stand. His body ballooned. He required mechanical assistance to move between rooms. Special devices were created just to carry his weight. Servants had to help him dress, bathe, and even relieve himself. Dignity, once the very core of his kingly image, slipped away, piece by piece. But no one dared to acknowledge it. This was still Henry VIII, the man who broke from the Catholic Church, who declared himself head of the Church of England, who executed those who questioned his will. And now, that same man had become a prisoner of his own swollen flesh. Yet even in this state, festering, immobile, in agony, he craved the illusion of youth. In 1540, Henry took a new wife, Catherine Howard. She was 19 years old. He was nearly 50 and already in physical ruin. To the court, it was a grotesque spectacle, a once glorious monarch dragging his wounded body beside a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. He claimed it made him feel young again, but she saw only a monster. Unable to bear the sight or the smell of her husband, Catherine turned to the company of a young courtier. She was caught, they both were, and executed. Heads rolled, the axe swung, and the king's loneliness deepened. By the time of his 6th and final marriage to Catherine Parr, Henry was no longer seeking love, but relief. Catherine was not a wife in the romantic sense, but more a nurse, a caretaker. She tended to his wounds, to his rage, to his despair. And she did so knowing what had happened to her predecessors. In these final years, the king was besieged not only by illness, but by paranoia. He became convinced that plots surrounded him. His mind, once sharp and decisive, unraveled into suspicion and cruelty. Loyal advisors were executed without trial. Friends were branded traitors based on whispers and glances. The king who had once inspired awe now ruled through fear. And all the while, the decay continued. The pain deepened. The stench grew stronger.
By the winter of 1546, Henry VIII was no longer truly alive. His body, bloated and diseased, was little more than a tomb of flesh. Gangrene had set into both legs. The ulcers festered with such intensity that the stench of rot seemed to cling to the walls of every room he entered. Servants soaked handkerchiefs in rosewater just to survive standing near him. He could no longer walk, even assisted. His breathing grew shallow. Fevers returned again and again, likely caused by sepsis as infection crept through his bloodstream. Some said it was the divine punishment for his sins. Others simply wept in silence. In his final days, the king spoke rarely, but when he did, his words unsettled everyone. He murmured the names of his long-dead wives, Jane Seymour, who had died giving him a son, Anne Boleyn, whom he had beheaded. Those who attended him claimed he was haunted. At night he would whisper into the darkness. No one dared ask what he saw. And yet no one at court could acknowledge that Henry was dying. According to English law, even suggesting the monarch's death was an act of treason. So physicians lied, advisors smiled,
Courtiers pretended the king was merely tired, resting, recovering, all while his flesh withered away, alive but decomposing. On January 27, 1547, the truth could no longer be denied. Henry summoned Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to his bedside. He could no longer speak, but when asked whether he died in the Christian faith, Henry squeezed Cranmer's hand. It was his last conscious gesture. In the early hours of January 28th, Henry VIII, the most powerful king in England's history, took his final breath. He was 55 years old, and though death had taken him, the nightmare wasn't over. Because of his immense size, a specially made coffin was required, larger than any ever built in England at that time. Preparing the body for burial was a grotesque task. Embalming practices were primitive. The organs were removed and the cavities filled with spices and herbs, but nothing could stop the decay. And then came the most humiliating moment of all. While Henry's coffin rested in the chapel at Sion Abbey, awaiting transport to Windsor, a terrible thing happened. In the silence of the night, the coffin began to leak. Fluids from the decomposing corpse seeped through the wood and onto the floor. In the morning, witnesses discovered that stray dogs had entered the chapel and licked the putrid liquid from the stones. This moment, so disturbing, so unimaginable, was recorded by chroniclers of the time. The once mighty king who had ruled by divine right, who had torn a country from Rome, who had broken laws and wives to secure his legacy, had become a leaking carcass defiled by animals.
The state funeral of King Henry VIII was held on February 16, 1547, nearly 3 weeks after his death. By then, the stench that clung to his coffin was legendary. And yet, the ceremonies were carried out with all the pomp and spectacle expected of a monarch who had once considered himself God's chosen ruler. Trumpets sounded, nobles lined the path, clergymen offered prayers. But beneath the heavy lid of the coffin, something far less glorious was decaying. Henry was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only one of his 6 wives to give him a legitimate son. Ironically, that son, Edward VI, would reign for only 6 years before dying at the age of 15. The boy for whom Henry had reshaped religion, restructured government, and shed oceans of blood would not live long enough to carry on the Tudor legacy. The throne passed not to a strong male heir, but to the daughters Henry had once cast aside. First came Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who attempted to undo her father's Protestant reforms and return England to Catholicism. Her reign was stained by persecution and burnings. And then, finally, came Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry had executed in cold blood. It was she who would bring about the true golden age of England. She, the child of the woman he had tried to erase, would become his greatest legacy. This twist of fate is more than poetic. It is crushing. Henry VIII had devoted his life to controlling his dynasty, his country, and even his own image. He commanded portraits to show him in full glory, broad-chested, fearsome, majestic. He silenced dissent. He erased enemies. He rewrote laws and doctrine. But in death, none of it protected him. The dogs at the chapel, the leaking coffin, the visible rot, all of it stripped away the myth. The man who ruled through fear died in degradation, and the image he so carefully cultivated was buried beneath the one truth he could never escape: mortality. Historians still debate the medical reasons for Henry's decline. Some say it was diabetes. Others suggest syphilis, strokes,
heart failure, or severe gout. Perhaps it was all of them. But the diagnosis hardly matters now. What remains is the story of a king who rose like a sun and set like a collapsing star. English historian Alison Weir once wrote, "It is one of history's cruelest paradoxes that a man who began with so much beauty and promise ended as a grotesque caricature of himself." Indeed, the story of Henry VIII is not just one of power and politics. It is a lesson in the limits of control, a reminder that even those who seem invincible, those who wear crowns, command armies, and shape nations, are still, at the core, fragile flesh. And when the body fails, when the mask of majesty falls away, what's left behind is just a man, alone, in pain, and slowly forgotten. The king who defied popes and beheaded queens, who once held England in his iron grip, ended as a cautionary tale. A tale not of glory, but of rot.